Sometimes the things you read online feel exaggerated, almost fictional. But every once in a while, you stumble across a story that feels far too real and far too disturbing to ignore. I grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It's the kind of place where kids rode their bikes at dusk and neighbors waved when they drove by. For most of my teenage years, I felt safe there, maybe even too comfortable. But one night during the summer before I left for college, that sense of safety shattered completely. It was later on 1:30 a.m., and I was in the living room scrolling through my phone. My parents were asleep upstairs, and the house was dead silent, except for the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. The curtains were drawn, but we had a small gap where the fabric didn't fully cover the front window. That gap is what changed everything. At first, it was subtle. I noticed a faint shadow stretching across the driveway, just at the edge of the streetlight. I assumed it was a neighbor walking their dog or maybe someone passing by. But when I peeked through that narrow slit in the curtain, my heart stopped. There was a man standing perfectly still at the end of our driveway. He wasn't moving, wasn't smoking, wasn't holding a phone, just standing there, angled slightly toward the house. I couldn't see his face clearly, only the silhouette of a hood pulled up, his arms slack at his sides. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My rational side tried to explain it away. Maybe he was lost, maybe he was waiting for someone. But he didn't look like someone waiting. He looked like someone watching. I ducked down beneath the window, crawling on the floor so I wouldn't be seen. My heart pounded in my ears, and I could feel sweat prickling at the back of my neck. After a few minutes, I convinced myself to check again. I inched up slowly, peering out. He was closer. He was standing halfway up the driveway, still facing the house, his head tilted slightly like he was studying it. I wanted to scream to call for my dad, but I couldn't make a sound. My phone was still in my hand, so I quickly typed out a message to my mom. Even though she was upstairs, there's someone in the driveway. I crouched there, waiting, feeling like every second stretched into an eternity. Then, in the stillness, I heard the crunch of gravel beneath shoes. He was walking toward the house. I scrambled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table. The sound grew louder, steady footsteps on the driveway, until they reached the porch. I heard the faint creak of our wooden steps, then silence. I couldn't breathe. The man was right outside our front door. I texted my mom again, panicked now. He's at the door. Please wake up. Moments later, I heard hurried footsteps from upstairs. My dad's heavy tread followed. Then finally, the porch light flicked on. By the time we opened the door, he was gone. Just the empty street, quiet and still. The next morning, we checked the security camera. The footage showed a man approaching the house, pausing at the bottom of the driveway, then slowly walking toward the door. Just before my dad turned on the porch light, the man looked directly into the camera and smiled. We sent the footage to the police, but they never identified him, and I'll never forget that grin. Frozen on the screen, a grin that told me he wasn't lost, wasn't waiting, wasn't curious. He was hunting. I thought the woods were empty that night. But then I heard a scream that no human should ever make. When I was 16, I lived in a rural town surrounded by dense forest. Our house sat at the edge of a long gravel road, where the trees pressed close and nights were darker than you could imagine. Growing up, I loved the woods, hiking, exploring, even camping there with friends, but that one summer night changed everything. It made me realize how thin the veil between curiosity and terror really is. It was just after midnight, a warm summer evening. My window was cracked open to let in the heavy, pine-scented air, and the sounds of crickets and distant frogs filled the quiet night. I lay in bed, scrolling on my phone, trying to fight sleep when I heard it. A scream. At first, I thought it was a coyote or some other animal. I'd lived here long enough to know how misleading the sounds of the night could be, but this scream was different. It wasn't erratic or animalistic. It was raw, human, and filled with unmistakable terror. My blood ran cold. I froze, straining to listen. Second scream pierced the stillness, louder this time, ragged and broken, echoing through the trees. My skin prickled as the sound seemed to get closer, and yet, whenever I glanced out the window, there was nothing but dark shapes and the wavering shadows of swaying branches. My mind raced. Could someone be hurt in the woods? Was it an accident, a prank, or something worse? But deep down, I felt a primal fear I couldn't shake. It wasn't just the scream, it was the intent behind it. It was a plea directed at me, at anyone, as if the darkness itself had a voice. I debated calling the police, but the rational side of me hesitated. They would tell me it was probably an animal or a prank, that teenagers sometimes got drunk in the woods. But the voice in my gut, the one that had kept me alive through every scraped knee and near miss in the forest, screamed at me not to go outside. Couldn't ignore it. The scream came again, this time fragmented, almost like it was being repeated. "Help me, help me, help me," it cried, and each syllable sent a shiver down my spine. I crept to the window, peering into the darkness. The forest was impenetrable, a solid wall of shadow, but I could sense movement among the trees. Something shifted, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with an unnatural tension. My curiosity outweighed my fear. I grabbed a flashlight and slipped quietly out the door, careful not to wake my parents. The gravel under my sneakers crunched softly, but it felt deafening in the still night. I stepped onto the dirt path leading toward the woods. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my heart leap into my throat. Then I heard it again, closer. A woman's voice, pleading, exhausted, desperate, "Help me."
Ow.
It carried a rawness, a fragility that made my stomach twist.
Stop.
I froze, the beam of my flashlight cutting weakly into the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. I took a cautious step forward. Another scream echoed, now fragmented and out of sync, as if there were multiple sources. I felt my pulse hammering, sweat slicking my palms, the air thick and suffocating. The woods, which had always felt alive and safe to me, now seemed predatory, closing in from all sides. I told myself it was a recording, some prank, a trick of the wind, but instinct screamed that it was real. I could feel the urgency in the voice, the desperation that could not be faked. I wanted to turn back, run for the safety of my house, but the sound pulled me forward, a magnet of fear and morbid curiosity. The rustling came again this time, distinct footsteps, careful, deliberate. I froze, straining to see between the thick trees. My flashlight illuminated glimpses of movement, shadows that didn't behave naturally, darting just out of the beam. The scream came once more, louder, closer. And then, for the first time, I realized it wasn't just crying for help, it was repeating. Over and over, in the same cadence. It was mechanical, yet agonized, as though the forest itself were taunting me. A sense of unreality washed over me. Every instinct screamed to leave, but my legs felt rooted. I could feel my heart throbbing in my ears, my skin crawling as if something unseen was brushing past me. Then came a sound that made my stomach drop. Whispering, low, guttural, indistinct, but unmistakably human. "Follow. Follow. Come closer." I spun on my heels, flashlight swinging wildly. The voice receded, but I could still hear the faint echo circling me, a predator in the darkness. Panic surged, ran, stumbling over roots, my feet tangling in vines, breath ripping through my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until the comforting glow of my porch light broke through the trees, and I slammed the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I sank to the floor, listening. For 20 minutes, the screaming continued, echoing around the house, circling, sometimes near, sometimes distant, always pleading, "Help me, help me." Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the night fell silent. No rustling, no whispering, no voice. Only the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of leaves outside my window. The next day, my father walked the edge of the woods, rifle in hand, scanning for any sign of a person or animal. He found nothing. No tracks, no disturbed undergrowth, nothing. Just the undisturbed silence of the forest. Weeks passed, and I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the mind, maybe a combination of wildlife and shadows. But deep down, I knew it was something else. The cadence of the screams, the mechanical repetition, the way the voice seemed to lure me into the woods. It was deliberate. It had a purpose. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even inside my house. Every breeze that rustled the trees made me flinch. Every time I stepped near the edge of the forest, I felt the presence of something waiting, always waiting. Years later, I still live near woods, but I never go near them at night. I've told friends, but they laugh it off, calling it a vivid imagination, teenage fear. But I remember that scream. I remember the way it wrapped around the night, pulling me towards something I could not see, something I did not want to confront. Sometimes when the wind blows just right, I swear I hear it again, faint, pleading, mechanical. Help me, help me. And I know it's still out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting for the next person foolish enough to follow. I always thought I knew my neighbors, till I realized one of them was watching me in ways I didn't want to imagine. When I moved into my first apartment, I was thrilled. It was small, but it was mine. A third-floor unit in an old building with wooden floors that creaked underfoot and thin walls that carried every sound. I liked the character of the place. Even if it had quirks, flickering lights in the hallway, a musty smell in the stairwell, but it felt safe. Or so I thought. On moving day, I met the neighbor across the hall. He introduced himself casually, smiling in a way that was just slightly off. Pale, damp-looking hair, mid-30s, eyes too dark and unblinking. "Welcome," he said, his voice warm but strange. I shook his hand and thanked him, chalking up the odd vibe to first impressions. That night, I was settling into my new apartment. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, the faint smell of cardboard lingering in the air. I was exhausted from moving, ready to sleep. But then I heard it. Soft footsteps in the hallway. At first, I ignored them. Old buildings always creak, and sounds traveled differently at night. But the pacing was deliberate, rhythmic, almost like someone was measuring the floor with exact steps. Then came the low humming, barely audible at first, a tune I couldn't recognize. My stomach twisted. Over the next few nights, the noises continued. Sometimes it was the humming, sometimes whispered words. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing. Old building, thin walls, an eccentric neighbor. But the more it happened, the more I felt it wasn't random. He wasn't just living across the hall, he was observing. One night, I woke abruptly. The bedroom door handle was turning. Slow, deliberate twists, pauses, twists again. My heart leapt into my throat. My hand instinctively reached for the baseball bat I had stashed under the bed. I froze, listening. "Let me in." The voice was low, almost coaxing, yet terrifying. I held my breath, trying to convince myself I imagined it. But the knob twisted again, and a soft scrape against the floor made me flinch. Every instinct screamed to run, to call the police, but I stayed still, gripping the bat so tightly my knuckles whitened. After a tense minute, the sound stopped. Silence reclaimed the room, but my body trembled uncontrollably. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I confronted him casually in the hallway. I asked, "Hey, were you near my door last night?" His eyes didn't blink, stared at me, too intense, too steady. Then came that unnerving smile, wide, too wide, like he knew more than he should. "Why would I be at your door?" he said, voice calm, almost teasing. He walked away without another word. I wanted to laugh it off, tell myself I overreacted. But deep down, I knew this was serious. That smile didn't belong to someone innocent. Something about it promised obsession, patience, and a subtle menace. Night after night, the sounds continued. Scratching on the door, whispering, footsteps pacing the hallway. It was always at night, always when I was alone. Sometimes I heard him outside my window, his presence just beyond the glass, silent but somehow audible. The building's thin walls betrayed nothing, yet every night felt like a trap. One particularly terrifying night, I woke to a scraping sound across the floor, at the door, this time something moving inside the apartment, in the darkness. My mind raced. Had he broken in? Was I imagining it? I crept toward the sound, flashlight trembling in my hand. Every corner of the apartment seemed different under the beam. Shadows stretching impossibly long, walls bending in the dim light. The scratching stopped abruptly. When I shone the flashlight across the room, I saw nothing. Nothing moved. But the air felt heavier, colder, as if the presence hadn't left. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run, to escape, but curiosity anchored me. I couldn't just ignore it. The following day, I called the landlord, feigning casual concern. "The neighbor across the hall, he's a bit odd," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. The landlord's sigh told me more than his words. "Look," he said slowly, "I probably shouldn't say this, but be careful. That guy has a history. The previous tenant, they moved out suddenly. Didn't say why, just left. Overnight." I pressed for details, but he dodged, muttering about privacy and past incidents. I didn't care. No, I knew I had to leave. The apartment that had once felt like freedom now felt like a cage, with unseen eyes following me everywhere, hearing every breath, every whispered thought. I moved out within a week, packed boxes heavy with relief and fear. But even after leaving, the memory lingered. I could still hear the whisper, faint but distinct, creeping into my mind in the dead of night. Let me in. Years later, I think about that apartment often. About the man with the too wide smile and the way he watched, waited, orchestrated every moment to unnerve me. I know he's still there, in that building, with new neighbors who will think they're safe, just like I did. And I know that some people, some presences don't stop. They don't fade. They wait, patient, calculating, until the next person falls into their rhythm. The last time I drove past that building, I slowed, heart hammering, staring at the window across the hall where my apartment had been. I couldn't see him, not clearly, but I felt it. That same weight, the same anticipation, the same grin etched into my memory. Some things don't just haunt you in dreams, they haunt you in daylight, in reality, in the very spaces you thought were safe. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear that whisper again. Faint, teasing, deliberate. Let me in. I'll never forget it. I'll never ignore it. I know I'll never truly feel safe again.